I studied at University of Exeter for many years. I was awarded a PhD a few years ago. It was Dickens' anniversary on the 7th of February this year, bicentenary, and I offered for my local library in Rawton to do a talk for them. And Dickens was was the speaker at the first free library to be opened in this country that was in Manchester in 1851. And I'm a great believer in, as he was, in providing education free of charge. That's why the tickets are free this evening. I did a presentation for National Library's Day at the Central Library. So this is the third talk. This is not a repeat talk. Poor old Tim here, he's had to sit through two already, and I did warn him. So it's going to be a change. I'm hoping this evening, the things I'm hoping to achieve is this. I'm hoping that you will go away this evening wanting perhaps to read Oliver Twist again, and possibly to read other Dickens' novels with a little bit more knowledge and insight into Charles Dickens as a person and also into Oliver Twist. We chose Oliver Twist for a couple of reasons. One, it's quite short. And having studied Dickens for 7 years, I appreciate short as opposed to Bleak House, which is about 800 pages. The second is it's very popular, it's engraved within popular culture, and I'm sure we're very familiar with that. The only other thing I'll say before we get started, I'm going to give you a perspective of Oliver Twist. It's not the only perspective of Oliver Twist. I suspect that a lot of the things I'm going to say this evening may or may not be familiar to you. So at the very offset, I don't want you to feel that this is the only way to interpret the book. So off we go. I've entitled the talk Oliver Twist, Parable, Providence and the Poor. You know what it's like when you start with alliterations with P. I had to keep going. But it suits really well. Parables play an important part in a lot of Dickens' novels. Hard Times, for example, Great Expectations. We're going to be looking at how Dickens uses the parable of the Good Samaritan as a key to understanding the novel. We're going to talk about Providence, how certain chance events happen to shape the novel. And finally, a big issue for Dickens' writing and his work, throughout his work, was the poor. But if I can just start with this speech that Dickens gave at Manchester Free Library in the 7th of September 1852. Excuse me for putting my glasses on. Ladies and gentlemen, I have long been, in my sphere, a zealous advocate for the diffusion of knowledge among all classes and conditions of men, because I do believe with all the strength and might which I am capable of believing anything, that the more a man knows, the more humbly and with a more faithful spirit he comes back to the fountain of all knowledge and takes to his heart the great sacred precept, on earth peace, goodwill toward men. So Tim, can we put on the first slide there? This is where Dickens was born. This year a statue was put in front of that, Mile End Terrace, now I think called Commercial Road in Portsea, Portsmouth. I don't know, he was born on the 7th of February, a Friday, the same day that David Copperfield was born. You may know that David Copperfield was a very autobiographical piece of work. His father, John Dickens, was a naval pay clerk. That's why when the Dickens family moved, it was always connected with the Navy. And his mother, Elizabeth Dickens. This is the house he was born. I'm just going to give you a bit of information about his childhood. What shaped him? 4 months after he was born, his father earned £176 a year. His father had a bit of a problem. He was a very generous man, very convivial, but just as with Mr. Micawber, he hadn't worked out a basic fact of life. Income must equal expenditure. And with John Dickens, I'm afraid expenditure did not always equal. 4 months after this, they moved several miles across the town to Kingston in Portsmouth, to 5 Hawk Street. Charles Dickens was to move 15 times before the age of 16. On most occasions, it was due to financial restraints being put upon him. Some of the things that drove him memories, he had a happy childhood. I suppose the happiest days of his life were spent in Chatham in Ordnance Terrace. He had members of the family staying with him. He was regularly read to by his mother and grandmother. He had a great love for books. He read all the 18th century classics, Tobias Smollett, Henry Fielding, William Golding. He was an avaricious reader. He also often went to the theatre and was taken there by a cousin, James Lamert. He had a very active imagination. His first thing that he wrote was in 1821. It was called Misna, the Genie of India. And as this young man grew up, a couple of unusual things that were happening. He was quite a relatively sickly child, and often he would have to stay in his bedroom, and whilst he was in his bedroom, he would read and read and read. He also had a fantastic memory to retain information. It's reckoned that he could vividly remember things from when he was 3 years old, and he was storing up all this information. The things that drove him, though, he was a driven man in many ways. The first thing was when his education was taken away from him. He had a bit of a problem because he had an older sister called Fanny Dickens, who was absolutely fantastic on the piano. In fact, won a place at the Royal Academy of Music. Now, when the Dickens family, when John Dickens was arrested for debt and sent first to the King's Bench prison, his sister Fanny was able to carry on with her education at the Royal Academy. Charles, however, at the age of 12, was put out to work. That caused a lot of resentment. Taking out from education to work. He worked in a blacking factory as a 12-year-old boy, basically sticking labels on polished bottles. He found that very hard. 3 years later, we're in a similar situation. He's back in school, the Wellington House Academy, doing really well. Again, the father's arrested for failure to pay rates. And again, he's taken out of school and at the age of 15, has to start as a clerk in the solicitors. Nothing wrong at all working as a clerk in solicitors, I hasten to add, but again, his education was taken away. Dickens, unlike other authors at the time who tend to be very rich backgrounds, he knows what poverty is. He remembers when he's 10 years old how his father takes his books away from him and sells them to a pawnbroker. He remembers something he calls the deed, which was drawn up between the tradesman and his father. He actively knew what poverty was. The two things that had effect etched on his brain as a child was, one, he was never, ever going to fall into poverty himself. And B, he wanted to help the poor. Could someone get me a drink? Sorry, very, very dry throat. Could someone get me a drink? So this is where it all started. What a relatively humble house. But this is where our greatest author... You know, last year, does anyone know that it was a bicentenary of William Thackeray's birth? I don't remember anything being celebrated by that, born in 1811. This year is Edward Lear's bicentenary, who wrote those fantastic limericks. But Dickens has placed a stamp on the national consciousness. And the last thing I want to say to you, it wasn't just in this country. We know about America. You may not know in France and Russia. He was fantastically well read by Dostoevsky in all the intellectual classes. And in fact, in the 60s, when the Russian Navy came into Portsmouth, the only place that the sailors were allowed to visit officially was his house, because they viewed him as someone who's a champion of the working class and the poor. When I gave a last lecture, a lady mentioned after the talk that her father had been in the Merchant Navy, and the only author the Russian sailors would talk about was Charles Dickens. So not only was he, sorry, thank you very much, not only was he a writer of England and Britain and America, but also of Europe. Can we go on to the next slide? Here he is. It's not a usual picture. I was quite amused when I came over Wednesday to see the picture of Dickens when he was about 25 on the posters. We used to see him, aren't we, with a beard and this is unusual. This was painted by Daniel Maclise in 1839. Take a look at that person. That's someone who's just almost, you could say, overnight reached celebrity status. How did he get there? Few little things. He worked as a journalist for 3 papers. The Mirror of Parliament, which was owned by his uncle, his mother's brother, The True Sun, and lately the Morning Chronicle, which wrestled with the Times. The 2 great daily newspapers of the time were the Times and the Morning Chronicle. The Times was Tory, and the Chronicle was Whig or Liberal. He learned his trade as doing shorthand as a young man of 17, and he would be in a very small lobby writing down shorthand the great speeches of the time, the Reform Act of 1832. He enlisted in the British Library and finished his education himself at the age of 18. And by this time, before he was commissioned to write Oliver Twist, sketches by Boz, the name Boz was his nickname for his younger brother Augustus. Boz, Moses being the son of the Vicar of Wakefield, written by William Goldsmith. Charles Dickens often had a blocked nose, so when he said Moses, it came out as Boses, and then he shortened that to Boz. He wrote under the name of Boz for 3 years before people knew who he was. He had to tell them who he was because there was all sorts of speculation going around who it was. I hasten to add very quietly, are there any fans of the Bronte sisters here? I'm a fan of the Bronte sisters. They had the same problem. If you remember, they published under the name of Currer, Ellis, Acton Bell. They had to come out because people were speculating that women couldn't possibly write novels like that, and it must be men. So Dickens came out and explained who he was. Just to give you an idea of the relative success he's enjoyed. 1836, the sketches he's been writing were in a collection of papers. The Monthly Magazine, the very first one he wrote, in November 1833 through to 1836. The first sketches by Boz, they were all collected together with 35 sketches illustrated by George Cruikshank, the same person who illustrated Oliver Twist. John Macarone, the publisher, in 1836 paid Dickens the princely sum of £100 for those sketches. Bear in mind, 3 years earlier, he was paid nothing for the Monthly Magazine subscription. 2 years later, Chapman and Hall, who wanted to republish sketches by Boz, very short stories, recommend you read them, paid £2,000. What had changed? Essentially, the Pickwick Papers. The Pickwick Papers were started in 1836. The fourth instalment, in July 1836, introduced a character called Samuel Weller. If, of course, you follow the diction, it was Samuel Veller. That one character projected Dickens almost overnight into literary superstardom. He left the Morning Chronicle in 1836, and he joined Bentley Miscellanea to edit it, where Oliver Twist appeared. Dickens was many things, but he was a very, very astute businessman. No one pulled the walls over his eyes. He was one of the first persons to introduce international copyright. What was going on with his work is he would write a sketch and someone would copy it and change the title, and could do that ad verbatim in this country in America. He was a shrewd businessman, so he said to John Bentley, I'll edit your magazine for you. If you pay me 5 guineas a week, I will come up with a story to sell your publication. And the story he came up with, of course, was Oliver Twist. You see that man, he's suffered and he's destined for great success. Of course, to have an oil painting commissioned by Daniel Maclise in 1839 would have cost him a deal of money. Next, please. I just want to talk to you about Dickens and Wiltshire, if I may. Does anyone recognise this? I'm sorry, it's a bit fuzzy. Where would that be? Wagon and Horses, that's right. It's been there through about 1665 on the A4 London Road. Unfortunately for us in Broughton and in Wooden Basset, we're not on the A4, the old London Road. So when you read William Cobbett in his Rural Rise, when he got on his horse and rode across the country, he went to Calne, but he didn't come to Wooden Basset because he went down the A4. What did he miss at Wooden Basset? I don't know. But here we are, the A4. Dickens, as a parliamentary reporter in 1836, had to go to Bristol and to Exeter to record the speeches of Lord John Russell. He stayed at the Wagon and Horses. And in Pickwick Papers, there's an interpolatory tale, in other words, an extra story called The Bagman's Uncle, which is set in the Wagon and Horses. The other issue he had in 1847, he wrote the Hymn of the Wiltshire Labourer, about labourers were forced to leave the country and to travel to America. If you read Martin Chuzzlewit, you will know that Mr. Becksniff, the villain, lives around 25 miles around Salisbury. So if you imagine Salisbury in the middle and do a 25-mile circus, that's roughly where Martin Chuzzlewit is set, all the scenes with Mr. Becksniff. Have we got anyone from Cairn here? I've got to be very careful about Cairn, because Cairn, if you go on the website, will tell you that they have a very strong connection with Dickens, because they say that Samuel Pickwick was a name taken from someone in Corsham. Far be it from me to cast aspersions about the validity of that statement, but Moses Pickwick was in fact a Bath coach builder, not the name of a boy that was left in a basket somewhere in Corsham. But if you pass that tale on, you didn't hear that from me. So Wiltshire does not, as you wouldn't be surprised, feature much in Dickens' work. Dickens was ostensibly a London-based writer. Okay? But there's a little bit about Wiltshire in there. So Tim, will you go on? This is the cover. The first thing I want you to notice is the original cover. It's dated 1838. Dickens, the businessman, realised that if he released his work in instalments, you and I would have to pay for the instalments one by one, and of course we want to buy the book when it came out as well. This is very interesting. This is an 1838. Richard Bentley, the name of the publisher. You'll see Oliver Twist, or the subtitle is The Parish Boy's Progress. Very important. Because one of the other things that Oliver Twist is as a parable is a take of Pilgrim's Progress. That's why he used that title. That's not often used now as you see that. The other thing I want to say to you, there's some fantastic book on Dickens over there. If you're going to buy any books on Dickens, may I make one recommendation to you? Buy the books with the illustrations in. Illustrations are very important, as we'll see in a minute, to understand what Dickens is saying. Every illustration that appeared in Dickens's work, Dickens took control of. If you buy works of Dickens, buy the illustrations. And if you want some tips about which types of books to buy, I'm more than happy to tell you later. This story was unusual. You see, most of the novels coming out at the time were called Silver Fork novels. They were about the rich. A bit like the Jane Austen type novels, and I am also, may I hasten to add, a great fan of Jane Austen as well. This was different because it wasn't about the upper middle classes, it was about the criminal underclass predominantly of London. It was about social conscience. It was about things people had never read before, and it was not well received by the critics. Partly, as we'll see later, they didn't actually believe that what Dickens was writing about was real. So it was a groundbreaking novel. Pickwick Papers was a wonder. Who's read Pickwick Papers? Isn't it a wonderful story? Mr. Pickwick travels around, and it's just a series of episodes, comic episodes, although there's some very serious points in Pickwick Papers. This, I would argue, is the first serious novel that Dickens undertook. Tim? This is a picture, probably well known. I don't need to interpret for you. It's called The Parable of the Good Samaritan. This is the key, and I will explain to you why, in my view, of understanding Oliver Twist. In the postmodern society we live in now, in the secularised society, when BBC or ITV or any television programme adapt Dickens, the first thing they extract is religion. Now that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because if you take religion out of Dickens, you cannot fully understand the novels. So let's try and understand this story. We know the story from the Bible, I trust, but a man goes down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He's attacked by robbers and left lying on the road for dead. 3 people come past. One is a priest. One is a Levite or lawgiver, and the third is a Samaritan, someone who has nothing whatsoever to do with a Jew. And it's the Good Samaritan who helps him. Dickens would know, he's very familiar with the Bible, very familiar with the Book of Common Prayer. The question preceding that, as Jesus taught that, was, who is my neighbour? And this is what Dickens was trying to put across. We know Oliver Twist, I trust. The first 7 chapters of Oliver Twist are about how the poor are abused in the workhouses. Oliver Twist, when he's brought into life by the parish surgeon who likes a drink, a bit like Sarah Gamp, he is laid in front of the fire. His mother has died, and will he live or will he die? Who cares? Who cares? But he struggles and comes back to life. Mr. Bumble, the fat, overweight beadle, comes along, gets his book out and says, S.T. Oliver Twist. At the age of 9, he stays at the farm. The parish, which represents in those days, not now, I appreciate, the church, the priest, has failed Oliver Twist. Who's coming along next? Well, if you remember, Dickens gets involved with Fagin and Jack Dawkins, or the Artful Dodger, and Charlie Bates. He doesn't realise that Fagin is an evil person. He thinks he's a very nice gentleman. And he doesn't realise that going around playing a game, taking handkerchiefs from people's pockets, is criminality. And they arrive in a courtyard in Clerkenwell. And just at that point, good old Jack Dawkins tries to take a watch from an elderly gentleman. When he fails, of course, Charlie and Jack leg it. Oliver stands there, dazzled in not knowing what to do, and he ends up in court under the gentle care of the police magistrate, Mr. Fang. The law. What sort of response is he going to get from Mr. Lang? Sorry, I said Mr. Lang. It's actually based on a character that Dickens met when he was writing, Mr. Lang of Hatfield Magistrates Court. The age of criminality in 1838 was 14. There were 3 things that could happen to Dickens. Sorry, could happen to Oliver Twist. 1, he could be transported for something he didn't do. 2, he could be hung. Or 3, he could be given hard labour. Any of those 3 would have ended Oliver's life at that particular time. The law has failed as it was failing Oliver and the type of children that he represented and the community of the poor. The church in the form of the parish was failing. Who was going to rescue Oliver? The Samaritan, the rich man, Mr. Brownlow. We need to understand culturally, the rich had nothing to do with the poor. The rich predominantly had no idea what was going on with the poor. Let me give you an example. In 1832, 50% of the children under 3 died in Manchester from cholera and typhoid because of poor sanitation. When they designed that city, it was designed intentionally, and Frederick Engels writes about this in the Industrial Classes, if you want to read it. They designed the city so that those who were rich in their carriages would never, ever go past the poor places in Manchester. They didn't realise what was going on. There was a segregation between them. If we were to go to St Bartholomew's, this is a lovely church, in 1830s, 1840s, what is likely to happen? The social divisions would be mirrored in the church. The poor in the workhouse would either be in the benches at the front or they would be in the gallery at the back. Wealthy people would have their own box pews or their own separate pews, some with curtains. Why? We don't want to see the poor. The social divisions were not seen to be wrong. They were etched deeply in society. Dickens is saying this: Oliver is left, and in the book, lying on the road outside the magistrate's court. The law has failed him. The church has failed him. Who will save him? But Dickens uses that analogy not once, but twice. As the story moves on, who is it that brings light upon Oliver's history? Who is it that rescues him? Nancy, the prostitute. Now, I'm going to tell you something about Nancy I don't think you know. If you do know, I'll be quiet now. How about that? Is that a fair deal? Nancy could read. Did you know that? Nancy could read. Just before she's going to meet Rose Maylie and Mr. Brownlow on the bridge, London Bridge, She says she has read something. That is very, very unusual. 1837, 40% of children in this country never went to school. Someone of that nature to be able to read was very unusual. She was a social outcast, and yet she was the one that helped. Dickens uses the parable of the Good Samaritan very early on. The parochial seal of the parish where Oliver is born is the Good Samaritan. Mr. Bumble shows someone, look at my coat, I've got a special button. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. This is what Dickens is saying. Of course, he's saying to his middle class readership, who is your neighbour? Who are you going to help? Tim? Now again, I do apologise, the focus might be better. This is why I said about the illustrations a few moments ago. This is Mr. Brownlow. This is Mrs. Bedwin, his housekeeper. This is Oliver. Mr. Brownlow is looking at a picture here. I'm giving the game away, aren't I? What's that picture? Blow it up, look at it. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan in that picture. That's why we need to look at the illustrations. Dickens is demonstrating and reinforcing that message. Mr. Brownlow is the Good Samaritan. Oliver is the person that is left. Tim? And here we have the scene on London Bridge with Nancy, Rose Maylie and Mr. Brownlow and Noah Claypole here. Noah Claypole's an interesting character. Dickens uses him to say that even among the poor, there is nothing. Noah Claypole is a charity boy. He's been brought up in a charitable institution, which is one step higher than Oliver. Oliver is the worst of the worst. He is an orphan. Agnes Fleming, his mother, gave birth to him without a father, and he's from the workhouse. Noah Claypole calls him workhouse. And this is where Oliver is. And the first 7 chapters of Oliver Twist just relay how difficult it was. Tim? This is now Providence. Now, you will say to me, Dr. Hooper, all writers use chants in their novels. Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, she's off to Chew Magna up the hill. There's a thunderstorm, and who rides to her rescue? Mr. Willoughby. Chants. Jane Eyre runs away from Edward Rochester. She's all on her own. She's on her last legs. She knocks on the door. Who opens the door? It just happens to be a relative. George Eliot in Adam Bede. We've got Hetty Sorrel carrying on with Arthur Donnithorne, the son of the squire. And who comes along the corner? Adam Bede. Yes, writers do use chants, because if you're going to write without chants, you're not going to get anywhere. I just want to say something to you, though, particularly what I feel, Providence. Dickens sees it, takes it to another level, what he believes to be providence. If I can just, as a prefatory remark, there was a big argument going on in the church at that time. Now, to us, we may feel today that the church isn't relevant. I want to tell you, when Dickens was writing, the church was right at the centre of all that was going on. Dickens' readers were incredibly religiously literate. And what the argument was going on at this time was special providence or general providence. General providence was a teaching that God sets the world going, and then we're just left to just carry on. Special providence is God's hand is upon particular people at particular times. In my opinion, it's not just personally my opinion, Dickens is trying to put across an argument for special providence in Oliver Twist. Oliver is a special child. He's special because he's incorruptible. Because Fagin's been employed by Mr. Monks, his half-brother, because there's a will float. There's always Dickens, there's always a will, isn't there? And there's always a way, of course, but there's always a will floating about in the background. Yeah? There it was. And in this will, Oliver's father had written that if his son was ever convicted for a crime, all his money, and he was a rich man, would go to Monks. So Monks pays Fagin to cause Oliver to commit a crime. But Oliver won't do it because he's incorruptible. At the age of 9, children were taken from the farm where children up to 9 before the workhouse, and then they were sent out to work. In this scene, we have a wonderful gentleman, Mr. Gamfield. It wasn't until 1839 it was illegal to send boys under 16 up chimneys. Mr. Gamfield was a chimney sweep. His raison d'etre was send the boys up the chimney, and if they don't want to come down, we'll light a fire underneath them. The lovely parish is wanting to sell Oliver to apprentice to Mr. Gamfield, and just about the moment the magistrate's going to sign, he knocks over a bottle of ink, and he's saved. You could say out of the frying pan into the fire. Next destination is that wonderful undertaker, Mr. Sowerby. Mr. Sowerby. And Oliver is employed as a mute to walk in front of the funerals. Just a little anecdote for you, if I may. Dickens wrote about what he saw. In Oliver Twist, parish child, someone in the workhouse, has died. In 1837, there were 48,000 funerals. 27,000 of those were children under the age of 10. Incredible. And those were funerals that were recorded, by the way. In the novel, the clergyman comes and I wouldn't suggest for 1 minute the clergyman today would do this, but the clergyman comes along 2 hours late, because he's only a poor person, he's not going to get paid for that. He comes 2 hours late, he spends 5 minutes over the pauper's funeral, pauper the poor child, and walks away. When Dickens included that in his novel, he got a very nasty letter from a clergyman. How dare Dickens suggest that clergy within the established church would bury a poor child in that way? And Dickens sent back a very interesting note saying, "Thou art the man." Because Dickens had seen that very clergyman doing exactly the same thing in Cooling in Kent. Interesting. Here we go, next thing for Providence. This is the incident I was telling you when something's going to be stolen. There's Charlie Bates, there's Jack Dawkins, there's Mr. Brownlow looking at the book, there's Oliver not having a clue what's going on. In the background is lurking, just around here, monks. This is the moment he's going to gain, because the minute Oliver's convicted, he will get the fortune. It's a key moment in the novel. But of all the people that Charlie Bates and Jack Dawkins are going to rob, it's Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Brownlow, the best friend of Oliver's father, Edwin Leaford. It's a key moment. Now you may choose to say, well, Dr. Hooper, that's very interesting. That's just chance. I think in the context of the whole novel, I would suggest you know it's more than that, it's Providence. So we've done Parable and Providence. Tim, we need to move on. I am very conscious and aware of the time. My greatest critic on time has gone out, my daughter has gone out for a meal this evening, so I'm relying on my wife to make various signals when the time comes. Now, some of you may have heard of Sebastian Faulks. I know the head of English where I work has heard of him, and I have discussions with him about that. Fagin. Sebastian Faulks would suggest to us that Fagin is a rather pleasant elderly man. He's not as bad as we may think. I want to say to you, if I may, that Dickens doesn't agree with that. It does frustrate me a little bit when writers and television producers comment on Dickens without actually possibly reading the book in its entirety. If you see in this picture here, Fagin, I would suggest to you throughout the novel, is described by Dickens as a loathsome reptile. When he is seen with Sykes, and Bill Sykes is a hard man, as we know, he describes him as the devil. If you read carefully, Fagin is described as the devil. Here, it seems quite a convivial scene, doesn't it? You know, but look at what he's holding here. Symbolism. Look at the fire. And Fagin is the worst type of criminal, the corrupter of children. He was actually based on a real-life character who was around in 1831. He achieved a bit of notoriety because this man was arrested. Solomon was his surname. I think it was Robert Solomon. He was an Irishman. He was arrested but escaped, and he was a bit of a celebrity person. Not a Jewish person, but he was actually Irish. So that's where that came from. So, and in the end, we find that very powerful scene. Do you remember when Fagin's in Newgate? And he's just about to be hung the next day, and Mr. Brownlow takes Oliver to see the judgment that it's supposed to take. Providential things. One big theme in Dickens, I like Dickens. Thomas Hardy, I love Thomas Hardy, but he's a fatalist, so I've got to say that to you. In Dickens, The good always prosper, and the evil get what's coming to them. And I can live with that. George Eliot, a bit harder for me to understand that. But there we are. Next big slide, Tim, because we are moving on. Right. The poor. How bad was it? I am not going to be able to stand here in Wooden Basset on a lovely day and help you to understand how bad it was for the poor. These are pictures, and you can get these off on the internet, as I've done. There was a French artist called Gustave Doré. He was employed in 1859 to spend 5 months in this country for 3 years and go and paint what he actually saw. And one of the things he used to paint was the plight of the poor. In 1857, it was estimated that 100,000 men were homeless. 18.7% of the population, which would work out to be 3.75 million people, were dependent on the poor law. It was terrible. It was terrible. A rich, wealthy man living in London and his family in 1840 would expect to live to be 44. Expect to live if things went well. Someone who was, say, a middle class, a clerk or something like that, would expect to live to 28. A tradesman or someone lower, their life expectancy was 22. A carpenter, which in my opinion is a very skilled labour, would have to work 70, 80 hours a week to support his family. And at the time Dickens wrote, what did the government do? There was not much charities at that time. Most of the charities kicked in 1851. They weren't about when he was writing. You see, there was a big problem. London was the only city in 1801 that had a population of over 100,000. By 1901 there was 15. In 1850, 400,000 Irish people came into the country, predominantly Bristol, Liverpool and London. The population of London, which is the biggest city in Europe, grew by 20% every 5 years. The population of the United Kingdom in 1801 was 16 million. By 1901, it was 47 million. At the time of Oliver Twist was written, 75% of people lived in cities. 50 years before that was only 25%. And who was supposed to deal with the poor? The government? No. The parish was supposed to deal with the poor. But they had no way of doing it. So what did the government do? They brought in the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. Because they had a theory, you see. The theory was this, partly by Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian: the poor were poor because they enjoyed it. The poor were poor because they enjoyed it. What are we going to do about that? I know what we'll do. We'll make the workhouse so bad that no one will want to go in there. Now, the poor didn't like the workhouse. If you read Our Mutual Friend, you know that Betty Higden, an elderly lady, does everything she can to get away from the workhouse. What would happen if your family was taken into the workhouse? Prior to 1834, they would be cared for in the community. Post 1834, they were put in the workhouse. Now, I like words. Do you like words? What do we have in foot and mouth? Do you remember the foot and mouth disaster? There was a big outcry because they were killing healthy cows. That was terrible, wasn't it? What did the government do? We call them potentially infected cows. Oh, well, that sounds a lot better, but they're still healthy cows. In the Gulf War, we had not bombing hospitals and schools, it was collateral damage. Language is really important, you know. In the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, there are specific responsibilities for the poor. Or we won't call them poorhouses, we call them workhouses. We won't call the poor poor, we call them paupers. Families were put in, the first thing would happen, you'll be institutionalised, husbands and wives split up, children split up. An awful life. Tim? Time has run away, and I want to give you a chance to respond to some questions. This is a picture, as you can see. This picture was referred to by Dean Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster Abbey a week after Dickens was buried. Dickens never wanted to be buried, by the way, at Westminster Abbey. He could not stand fuss. He could not stand attention. It was all they could do was to put up a plaque for him in Rochester Cathedral. Nonetheless, the country was not having their greatest writer buried in an obscure graveyard. And this is the picture that Arthur Stanley, Dean Stanley in Westminster Abbey talked about. It's the picture of Lazarus and the poor. Now that's less common, let me just explain. It's a story in the Bible about how a rich man has much food and partying and everything he wants, but at his gate there's a poor man called Lazarus who has nothing, who actually has to feed with the dogs. And what Dean Stanley said of Dickens, there has never been a greater writer that has revealed the extent of the poor to the rich. He pulled back the curtain that separated the rich from the poor. One of the greatest things Dickens did was to say to the wealthy, and predominantly his readers were middle class and class, this is the true state of the poor. And I will finish with this. In Oliver Twist, do you remember the last scenes when at Jacob's Island, where Bill Sikes is hiding out, and he's with Charlie Bates, and when he actually falls, when he sees that spectre of Nancy. Dickens wrote about a place called Jacob's Field in that, which was a place that Dickens went to. When he worked in that blacking factory when he was 12 years old, he walked 5 miles to work and 5 miles back. By the time he was 15, he knew London like the back of his hand. He knew London like the back of his hand. Jacob's Island was a horrible, cholera-filled, destitute place. And if you went to visit that, you couldn't believe people lived there, but they had to. And such was the ingrained sense of indignity about Dickens. There was a meeting of the Public Health Corporation in 1841 that actually found that Jacob's Island didn't exist and it was a figment of Dickens' imagination. Dickens was a great writer. He had experienced the poor and poverty, and he wanted people to understand that. And that's one of the reasons why, in my opinion, that he's been such a great, enduring writer.